Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time we're diving into schizophrenia, a condition that's been a real puzzle for experts for quite a while now, over a century.
Yeah, it's definitely a complex one.
We've got a ton of interesting research and case studies to go through, and you were the one that shared Christopher Frith's book with me, The Cognitive Neuropsychology of Schizophrenia. So that's going to be kind of our guide today.
It's a great book.
It is, yeah. And instead of just like listing out the symptoms, we're going to look at schizophrenia from this cognitive neuropsychology lens,
Yeah.
which basically means like, how does the brain process information differently in this condition, which can like really help us understand, why people with schizophrenia experience the things that they do.
Exactly.
Because it's not always straightforward. It's not like a broken bone that you can easily see. Even defining it can be a challenge, right?
Oh, absolutely. One of the biggest hurdles with schizophrenia is that the symptoms can vary so much from person to person and even in the same person over time.
Yeah.
It's like trying to solve a puzzle where the pieces constantly change shape.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good analogy.
Yeah.
And Frith's book really drives that point home with those case studies. Like the one about PL, who was convinced his food tasted like poison and that his hallucinations were like the devil's doing.
Yeah, and then there's SW, a math teacher who was a really social person.
Right.
But then he just withdrew, completely started neglecting his appearance and experiencing all these delusions about religion. It was wild.
It's just amazing how different the experiences can be. So like, how did experts even begin to like classify this? I know there's been a lot of debate over the years.
Yeah, early on there was this psychiatrist Bleuler, and he really tried to find like this core set of symptoms to consistently define schizophrenia, but it was really tough to pin down.
Yeah, I bet.
Later on, Crow came along and he proposed two distinct syndromes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 is focused on those more like outward positive symptoms like the hallucinations and delusions we were just talking about.
Okay.
And type 2 centers on the more internal negative symptoms like flat affect, poverty of speech, and social withdrawal.
So even like categorizing the symptoms is tricky.
It really is.
That just highlights how complex this condition is and what a challenge it is to diagnose and treat it. So where do we even begin to understand what's happening in the brain with schizophrenia?
Well, one popular theory is the dopamine hypothesis, which suggests that schizophrenia is linked to an overactivity of the neurotransmitter dopamine in certain areas of the brain.
Okay, remind me, what is dopamine again? So it's something to do with how our brain cells communicate, right?
Exactly. Dopamine is this chemical messenger that plays a role in a lot of brain functions, including movement, motivation, and reward.
Okay.
And there's pretty convincing evidence for its role in schizophrenia.
Okay.
For example, antipsychotic drugs work by blocking dopamine receptors,
Okay.
and they can really significantly reduce positive symptoms like hallucinations.
So that like supports the dopamine idea. Is there anything else that points in that direction?
Yeah, we also see that amphetamines, which increase dopamine levels, they can actually worsen those same symptoms in people with schizophrenia.
Oh, wow.
Plus, studies have found differences in dopamine receptors in the brains of people with schizophrenia compared to those without it.
So it sounds like dopamine plays a key role, but you mentioned earlier that it doesn't explain everything.
Right, it's just one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Right.
Think of it like this dopamine is an important key, but it might unlock one door while jamming another.
Okay.
Focusing solely on dopamine could lead us down a path where we neglect other important factors.
What else should we be considering then?
Well, if we think about the bigger picture, we know that some people with schizophrenia experience side effects from antipsychotics that actually resemble Parkinson's disease.
Wait, isn't Parkinson's linked to low dopamine?
Right.
And these medications are blocking dopamine. That seems like a contradiction.
It is interesting, isn't it? And
Yeah.
it highlights the complexity of this system.
Yeah.
Parkinson's is associated with dopamine depletion in a specific brain pathway, and antipsychotics might inadvertently impact that pathway too.
Yeah.
We also see that long-term use of antipsychotics can lead to something called tardive dyskinesia.
What's that?
It involves involuntary movements, and it's thought to be caused by the brain trying to overcompensate for the blocked dopamine, potentially leading to a kind of supersensitivity.
So it's a real balancing act,
It is.
trying to manage the symptoms of schizophrenia without causing other problems.
Exactly. And it reminds us that schizophrenia might involve physical alterations in the brain's structure itself, not just neurochemical imbalances like with dopamine.
Okay, that brings us to the research on brain structure. Frith's book mentions some interesting findings from neuroimaging, right?
Yes, studies using techniques like CT scans have revealed enlarged ventricles in the brains of some people with schizophrenia.
Okay, remind me, what are ventricles?
They're basically fluid-filled spaces within the brain,
Okay.
and their enlargement could suggest a loss of brain tissue.
So are you saying parts of the brain might be shrinking? That's a little unsettling.
It is a sobering thought, and it raises questions about whether schizophrenia could have a neurodegenerative component similar to Alzheimer's disease.
Wow, okay. Are there other structural differences that stand out?
Researchers have also observed that the hippocampus and the cortex adjacent to it, which play a crucial role in memory and learning, tend to be smaller in people with schizophrenia.
So it's not just about the spaces between brain areas getting bigger,
Right.
but certain brain areas themselves might be affected. That's a lot to consider.
It is.
But how does this all relate back to the cognitive aspects of schizophrenia, which is really the focus of Frith's book?
Well, that's where cognitive neuropsychology comes, and this field focuses on how people with schizophrenia process information differently, which might be connected to these structural and chemical changes in the brain.
So even if the brain's hardware is altered, it's the software, the way information is processed,
Yeah.
that might be malfunctioning too.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's a helpful way to think about it.
It is. And despite the many challenges in studying these cognitive impairments, researchers have identified some consistent patterns.
Okay.
For instance, problems with attention and memory are common in schizophrenia.
I can see how that would be incredibly disruptive to daily life. Are there other examples?
Yes. Even simple perceptual tasks can be challenging. Frith mentioned something called psychomotor retardation, where even basic movements and responses are slowed down. It's like everything is running on a delay.
Wow. You can really start to see how these cognitive issues could make it difficult to function in the world.
Yeah.
It's not just about strange thoughts. It's about the brain struggling to process information and react appropriately.
Exactly. And even something as simple as naming a color can be difficult.
Oh, really?
There's a classic test called the Stroop test, where you have to name the color of a word, not read the word itself.
Okay.
Imagine seeing the word RAD printed in blue ink. You have to say blue, which is trickier than it sounds.
Yeah, I can imagine that would be extra hard if your brain is already struggling to process information. Does this type of difficulty show up in other ways?
Yes, this kind of disconnect between perception and response is a key feature of how cognitive neuropsychology helps us understand schizophrenia. But before we delve further into that, let's shift gears and talk about the more prominent outward symptoms like delusions and hallucinations.
All right, let's dive into that. Hallucinations are particularly intriguing. Remember PL hearing voices he attributed to the devil?
Yes.
It must be so disorienting to experience things that aren't really there.
It is. Hallucinations are essentially perceptions without external stimuli, like hearing voices when no one is speaking or seeing things that aren't there. Delusions, on the other hand, are firmly held false beliefs that aren't based in reality.
Like someone believing they're being controlled by outside forces or that they have special powers.
Exactly. And these symptoms aren't just random occurrences. Frith highlights how they might actually be linked to failures in what's called self-monitoring.
Interesting. What exactly does that mean?
It's like an internal feedback loop in our brains. We're constantly monitoring our own actions and thoughts, comparing them to our intentions. For example, if you're typing and accidentally hit the wrong key, you instantly recognize the error and fix it.
Right.
Self-monitoring helps us stay on track and make sense of our own actions.
So you're saying that this internal feedback loop is disrupted in schizophrenia.
Precisely. Frith suggests that this disruption leads to a failure to recognize our own actions and thoughts as self-generated, which can result in misinterpretations we see in delusions and hallucinations.
So instead of recognizing that a thought or sensation is coming from within ourselves, it feels like it's coming from an external source.
Yes, and that can be incredibly confusing and frightening. Think about PL believing his food was poisoned. Maybe he felt anxious or tasted something off, but instead of recognizing that as an internal sensation, he attributed it to an external cause, the devil.
So it's like the filter that normally separates our internal world from the external world is malfunctioning.
That's a great analogy. This impairment in self-monitoring helps to explain not only delusions and hallucinations, but also some of the communication difficulties associated with schizophrenia.
You mean things like disorganized speech and word salad?
Yes. If you're not effectively monitoring your own speech, you might not catch errors or notice when your words don't make sense to others. It's like talking on autopilot without a way to course correct. Frith connects this breakdown in self-monitoring to a broader concept he calls disorders of willed action, which is central to his book.
Okay, let's unpack disorders of willed action. What does that mean?
It refers to disruptions in the systems that generate and control our intentional actions. Basically, it means that the smooth flow of thought into action that most people experience is disrupted in schizophrenia.
So it's not just that actions are strange or unusual.
Yeah.
It's that the very intention behind those actions is muddled.
Exactly. Frith describes it as a three-level problem. First, there's the inability to generate spontaneous action. Think about how effortlessly you decide to pick up your coffee cup in schizophrenia. That simple act might feel incredibly difficult.
So it's not just a lack of action, but a lack of control over initiating action.
Precisely. And this difficulty initiating action can manifest in various ways, like the poverty of speech and social withdrawal often seen in schizophrenia. But before we dive into the other two levels of willed action, we need to take a quick break. We'll pick up right where we left off when we come back.
Welcome back. We're in the middle of unpacking disorders of willed action, which Frith uses to describe the disruption of intention and action in schizophrenia. We talked about the difficulty generating spontaneous actions. What are the other two levels?
Right. So the second level is what we call perseveration.
Perseveration, that sounds familiar. Is it kind of like getting stuck in a loop?
Exactly. It means getting caught up in repetitive behaviors and having trouble switching tasks. Imagine trying to cook dinner, but finding yourself constantly watching the same dish over and over, unable to move on to the next step.
Oh, I can see how that would make everyday life incredibly frustrating.
It certainly can. And then the third level is distractibility, where actions are driven by irrelevant external stimuli.
So instead of focusing on what you intend to do, you're constantly being pulled in different directions by whatever's happening around you.
Yes, and this can make behavior seem fragmented and illogical. It's almost like the brain is overwhelmed by all the incoming information and struggles to filter out what's important.
That makes those earlier examples of cognitive difficulties, like trouble with attention and the Stroop test, even more understandable.
Absolutely. These different levels of willed action disruptions all contribute to the challenges faced by individuals with schizophrenia.
So we've got these disorders of willed action and this breakdown in self-monitoring. And Frith ties them both back to that tricky concept we touched on earlier, meta-representation.
Yeah, he suggests that a breakdown in meta-representation might be a core factor underlying many of the symptoms we see in schizophrenia.
Okay, I know we skimmed over this before, but can you remind me what meta-representation actually means? It sounds pretty complicated.
It is a complex concept, but think of it as the ability to represent our own thoughts and intentions, as well as the thoughts and intentions of others. It's what allows us to understand that other people have minds of their own and to predict their behavior based on that understanding.
So it's like having a mental model of both your own mind and the minds of others.
Exactly. It's crucial for social interaction, communication, and even just making sense of the world around us.
So how does this all connect back to schizophrenia?
Well, if meta-representation is impaired, we might struggle to distinguish between our own thoughts and actions and those of others, which can lead to the misinterpretations we see in delusions and hallucinations.
So going back to PL, believing his food was poisoned, maybe an intrusive thought popped into his head, and instead of recognizing it as just a thought, his own thought, it felt like it came from somewhere else, leading him to blame the devil.
That's a great example. And the same goes for SW. And his religious delusions, maybe anxieties or internal conflicts about his faith, were misinterpreted as external forces acting upon him.
It really highlights how crucial meta-representation is for navigating the world and understanding our place in it.
It is, and it also helps explain some of the communication difficulties seen in schizophrenia. If you can't accurately represent the intentions and knowledge of the person you're talking to, communication becomes much harder.
It's like trying to have a conversation with someone when you're both speaking different languages.
Yes, there's a disconnect. Frith discusses a fascinating experiment that highlights this disconnect in another condition where meta-representation seems to be disrupted autism.
Autism. I thought we were focusing on schizophrenia.
We are, but bear with me, it might seem surprising to compare the two as they present very differently in terms of outward behavior.
Right. People with autism often exhibit social withdrawal, repetitive behaviors,
Yeah,
and have trouble communicating. It doesn't seem like the same thing as hallucinations and delusions.
that's true. The surface symptoms are quite different, but what's interesting is that both conditions might share an underlying impairment in meta-representation, just in different ways.
So in autism, how does this meta-representation problem show up?
It often leads to difficulty understanding the mental states of others. There's a classic experiment called the Smarties test. Imagine you show a child a Smarties tube, but when they open it, it's full of pencils instead. Then you ask, what will your friend who hasn't seen inside the tube think is in it?
I'd assume most kids would say their friend will think they're smarties, because that's what's usually in those tubes.
Exactly. But children with autism often struggle with this. They might say that their friend will know there are pencils inside, even though the friend hasn't seen it.
It's like they're not able to separate their own knowledge from what their friend might know.
Precisely, it suggests they have difficulty understanding that others can hold beliefs that are different from their own. And while the outward symptoms might differ, Frith proposes that this core difficulty in representing mental states could be similar in schizophrenia.
So even though schizophrenia and autism look very different on the surface, they might share a common thread, a difficulty understanding and representing mental states, both our own and those of others.
Yes, and this brings us back to disorders of self-monitoring and how they contribute to those misattributions we see in delusions and hallucinations. Remember that internal feedback loop we talked about.
The one that helps us recognize our own thoughts and actions is self-generated.
Exactly. Fritz suggests that the breakdown of this loop leads to those misattributions, creating a sense that our own thoughts and sensations are coming from an external source.
That must be incredibly disorienting. Is there anything in the brain itself that could explain why this internal feedback loop might be disrupted?
Frith points to the frontal lobes, particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in executive function planning and self-control.
And remember we talked about how damage to the frontal lobes in neurological patients can lead to problems with willed action, which look very similar to what we see in schizophrenia.
Right, and the frontal lobes rely heavily on dopamine for proper functioning. So if dopamine levels are disrupted, it stands to reason that prefrontal cortex activity would be affected.
It all seems to be connecting the dopamine hypothesis, the brain structure findings, and now this idea of meta-representation and frontal lobe dysfunction. But is there one single cognitive deficit that underlies all of this, or is it more complicated than that?
That's a question that researchers have grappled with for a long time. Frith explores this in his book and acknowledges the complexity.
So is he saying that meta-representation is the only factor at play, or is it part of a bigger web?
He suggests that a breakdown in meta-representation could be a core contributing factor, but acknowledges it's not the whole story. There are likely multiple levels of dysfunction involved, ranging from neurochemical imbalances to structural brain abnormalities to social and environmental factors.
That makes sense. It would be surprising if something as complex as schizophrenia could be boiled down to a single cause. It's more likely an intricate interplay of many factors.
Exactly. And while we're still unraveling all the pieces of the puzzle, this cognitive neuropsychology approach helps us to connect the dots and gain a deeper understanding of how schizophrenia affects the brain and the mind.
It's definitely a thought-provoking way to approach this condition.
Yeah.
So what are some of the key takeaways you hope listeners are getting from our discussion?
Well, I hope they're seeing that schizophrenia is not just about strange thoughts and behaviors. It's about understanding the profound cognitive challenges faced by individuals with this condition. It's about understanding the why behind the symptoms, not just observing the what.
It's a reminder that mental illness is not simply a weakness or a lack of willpower. It's about complex processes happening in the brain.
Precisely. And I also want to emphasize the potential of cognitive neuropsychology as a framework for understanding schizophrenia. By studying how the brain processes information differently in this condition, we can gain valuable insights and potentially develop more targeted treatments.
It's about piecing together a puzzle, looking at the brain structure, its chemical messengers, and how all of that impacts the way a person thinks, feels, and acts in the world.
Right. And while we've covered a lot of ground, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought-provoking question to consider.
Ooh, I love a good cliffhanger. What is it?
If meta-representation is so crucial to our understanding of ourselves and others, what are the implications of trying to modify or enhance it through technology or medication? That's something we'll delve into in our final segment.
Welcome back to our deep dive into schizophrenia. We've been, exploring this complex condition through a cognitive neuropsychology lens, which really focuses on how the brain processes information.
Yeah.
And we ended the last segment with a big question about meta-representation.
Yeah, we were talking about the implications of trying to modify or even enhance meta-representation, with technology or medication.
Right.
It's a question that really gets at, what makes us human?
Yeah.
Our ability to reflect on our own thoughts and understand, other people's perspectives and just navigate the social world is so tied to our sense of self.
Right. So messing with those abilities seems like a pretty big deal. Are we kind of crossing a line by trying to change something so fundamental?
It's a really tough question to answer. On the one hand, imagine the possibilities if we could enhance meta representation for people struggling with things like schizophrenia or autism.
Yeah,
We could potentially alleviate so much suffering associated with, delusions, hallucinations, and social isolation.
that would be huge. But as you said earlier, there's a lot to be cautious about. How do we make sure we're using these interventions ethically and responsibly?
That's where the discussion about ethics is crucial.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of the potential risks and unintended consequences. It's not just about what we can do, but what we should do.
For example, like if we start enhancing meta-representation, are we also increasing the potential for manipulation? Could people be more easily swayed or influenced if they're better at reading others' thoughts?
That's definitely a valid concern. Think about the impact on advertising or political campaigns, if they could precisely target our deepest desires and vulnerabilities.
Yeah, it sounds a little bit like a dystopian sci-fi movie to me.
Maybe, but as technology keeps advancing, what seems like science fiction can quickly become reality. We need to be prepared for these ethical dilemmas and have, open and honest conversations about the potential benefits and risks.
And it's not just about the potential for manipulation. What about access to these interventions? Would they be available to everyone, or would they just worsen the gap between, those who can afford them and those who can't?
That's a really important point. We have to be mindful of how these technologies could, further exacerbate existing disparities. Access to cognitive enhancement shouldn't be determined by someone's socioeconomic status or privilege.
It sounds like this whole conversation about meta-representation really opens up a Pandora's box of ethical considerations.
It does, but these are discussions we need to have. As we learn more about the brain and the mind, we have to grapple with the ethical implications of our discoveries.
Frith's book doesn't offer easy answers, but it definitely pushes us to think critically about these issues.
Right. He's not telling us what to think, but he's encouraging us to think deeply. That's one of the most valuable things about his work. It pushes us beyond simply studying the brain to considering what it means to be human.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the cognitive neuropsychology of schizophrenia, what are some of the key takeaways you want listeners to walk away with?
Well, first, I hope listeners have gained a deeper understanding of the immense cognitive challenges faced by individuals with schizophrenia. It impacts not only thoughts and perceptions, but also the very core of self-awareness and our ability to interact with the world.
It's a powerful reminder that mental illness isn't a sign of weakness or a lack of willpower. It's about understanding the complex interplay of biology experience and cognitive processes.
Absolutely. And I hope listeners appreciate the power of the cognitive neuropsychology approach. By studying the mind as an information processing system, we can get valuable insights into the mechanisms underlying mental illness and hopefully develop more effective treatments.
It's about moving beyond just observing symptoms and digging deeper into the why behind those symptoms.
Exactly. And finally, I hope this deep dive has left everyone with a sense of wonder and curiosity about the human brain. It's an incredibly complex and fascinating organ, capable of both brilliance and vulnerability. The more we learn about how the mind works in both health and illness, the better equipped we are to create a world where everyone can thrive.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the cognitive neuropsychology of schizophrenia.
It's been my pleasure.
And to our listeners, keep those minds curious and engaged. Until next time, happy exploring.